Please welcome our first panel, Mete Coban, Jeff Curry, Barnaby Pace, and Cassie Sutherland. This session will be moderated by Phil Bloomer.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm Phil Bloomer from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And we've got a great panel for you today to speak about the green energy shift and are we on track, and what, if we're off track, how are we going to deal with it? We've got a fantastic panel today made up of Jeff Curry, the Global Head of Commodities Research at Goldman Sachs, Cassie Sutherland, who's the Managing Director of Climate Solutions and Networks at C40, which is the big cities of the world, and then also Barnaby Pace, who's the Senior Campaigner at Global Witness, working on the European gas sector at the moment, but has worked on many others in the past. And we also have an empty chair, which at the moment is going to be occupied, we hope, shortly by Councillor Mete Coban, and he is on his way, but unfortunately there's been a problem with the traffic. So let me start really by just saying very briefly what a fantastic speech we had from Vanessa, and I think she spoke. She spoke so eloquently about the fact that we're on a precipice of climate catastrophe, that we know that there are tipping points, we may have passed them, we may be approaching them, that's not clear. But what is clear is the human catastrophe, and indeed the planetary catastrophe that will happen unless we step back from that precipice. We had only 2 days ago the announcement that 6% increases in greenhouse gases this last year, rather than a reduction. And so we are in a situation of extraordinary concern. And this panel is there to look at that concern, particularly in the conditions that we have at the moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the extraordinary energy as well as food crisis that's helped to generate and exacerbate. So I'm going to move first straight, and I should say, think about your questions, because you can either put them down on the app or there'll be roaming mics later. So I'm expecting you all to pay an enormous amount of attention and come back with some fantastic questions to the panel that are the most difficult ones. Thank you very much. So I'm going to pass, first of all, to Jeff and Barnaby and just ask you to talk a little bit about, we've got the zero transition to by 2050. That's supposed to generate or save us around $12 trillion if we get it right in terms of the losses that would otherwise happen. And yet we've got the Russian invasion at the moment with the gas prices, with the energy crisis that we have and the shift back into coal and gas. So can you just set out for us what you think we need from both government and business over the next short period? And a big hand to Mete for coming despite the difficulties. Thanks for joining us, Mete. I have introduced you, but we'll come back to you in a moment. So Jeff first, please.
Well, let's start with the observation that emissions are likely to be up substantially this year. Some estimates put them as high as 6%. Why? Because we're turning to wood and coal, which emit far more emissions than other energy sources. And I want to start by just giving some real basic commodity fundamentals, is that when we think about commodities or energy, there's organic energy and there's inorganic energy. And what do I mean by organic? It's the carbon-hydrogen bond. For those of you who took organic chemistry. And by the way, that's the basis of the planet Earth. That's what separates us from other planets. And when we think about within organic energy, what is food called? Carbohydrate. What are fossil fuels called? Hydrocarbons. What is the difference between a carbohydrate and a hydrocarbon? An oxygen. That's it. They're the same thing. You burn wood, you burn coal, corn, you burn any wheat, it's going to create emissions just like burning the hydrocarbons. In fact, in some cases, they're going to create more emissions. And when we think about, actually, to give you an idea about the difference between a hydrocarbon and a carbohydrate, you want to fly to Mars, you got to put one fuel on board that spaceship that feeds the astronaut and goes into the rocket booster. And what you need to do is figure out how to get that oxygen in and out of those two types of fuels. That's how close they are. And I like to point out, going back for a millennia, that human beings have used that carbon-hydrogen bond, at the center of how they fuel themselves, feed themselves, and maintain their prosperity. So, it is a huge challenge, and I think what I'm trying to tell you, broaden what you're thinking about in terms of what's creating emissions. Because again, they're up this year because we're burning wood, we're burning coal, peat moss, and we're turning to everything we possibly can, which is telling you, where are we in this track? We're way off. And when we think about net zero 2050, that's way off in the future. We need to be thinking about 2023, not alone 2022. And I think as interest rates go higher and higher and higher, we start to focus on the today, not the tomorrow. And I think as we need to, and then to answer your question, what do we need to do to deal with this? When we think about ESG methods or voluntary carbon markets, there is no such thing as a market without a cost. We have been very vocal as saying we need to have carbon markets that have a cost to them. And the only way you get a cost is you have to have compliance markets. I like to point out, this is not too far off of the 1970s when we had the war on acid rain. Do people remember those gargoyles melting on the cathedral in Cologne? I'm old enough, I do. But we created compliance. Do you remember when Volkswagen got in trouble for violating the rules around aerosols, which was the cause of acid rain? You know how much they paid? $20 billion. We need to get to that point before we're going to solve this problem. You need to have compliance, rules, regulations, costs that are going to create the market like we had with sulfur to solve the acid rain. So one last point I want to say, how did we get to the point where we had those compliance markets? I like to call it the Lake Erie moment, when you had Nixon sign into law the Clean Air Act Amendment. So to get to, and when I say the Lake Erie moment, Lake Erie was on fire, 1969, Richard Nixon signs into law the Clean Air Act Amendment, and from that point, we started to create real rules and regulations, compliance, and so forth. And when we think about ESG and investors trying to do it, they cannot internalize or socialize the cost of a negative externality. Only the governments do, and we have to get to that point.
Thank you. That's great. Very important in terms of this leadership role that has to come from governments. Barnaby, over to you.
Sure. I mean, clearly we're not on track. That barely needs saying. Vanessa's made it extremely clear. If you weren't already aware, we're already approaching 1.5 degrees. And, the UNFCCC put out a paper yesterday, day before, saying that we're probably on track for 2.5 degrees by the end of the century. We need to have emissions drop by 45% by 2030, according to the IPCC's report a few years ago, and we're on track for a 10% rise by 2030. 10% rise is not a 45% decline. We are way off track. We need to make some changes very fast. That said, in Europe at least, the invasion of Ukraine has certainly concentrated minds that more and more people are getting that gas, which is, in my mind, the last fossil fuel, the one that was pitched as the clean fossil fuel, even though it's not, it's nearly as bad as coal and others, especially once you take into account methane. People are getting that gas is not the solution to this, it's the problem, right? It's our addiction to fossil fuels that are feeding that problem. And I think, I agree with Jeff to a certain extent of we need to be focusing right now on the decisions we're making right now, but those decisions will define what our position is in a decade, in 2 decades, in 3 decades. Because if we make the mistake that we made after 2006, when Russia turned off the taps, 2009, when the same crisis occurred, 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, At those decision points, Europe decided we should go for diversification rather than transition. And there were people in Brussels saying, we need to do energy efficiency, we need to get off gas. And instead, they went, well, we'll get gas from somewhere else. And in the end, Russia went from supplying 25% of Europe's gas in 2004 to 40% of Europe's gas in 2019. All it did was continue the addiction to fossil fuels. The decisions we make now about what infrastructure we build will determine what infrastructure is there in 30 years' time. If you build a new LNG terminal, that's going to have a lifespan. If you build a new power plant, that is built on the premise that it's got a 30, 40-year lifespan. Even if you put a new gas boiler in the corner of your kitchen, that should have a 15 to 20-year lifespan, and you're committing to burning fossil fuels in it for 15 or 20 years. Hopefully now, minds are concentrated, and we are starting to see that curve, which is still far from the right track, coming down. The IEA said, I think today or yesterday, that we're nearing peak gas. So you can see that curve is getting there, but we need to be moving really rapidly ahead on the solutions that we have, electrification, changing electricity production to renewables, which is 9 times cheaper than gas in the UK right now. The economics clearly align with the right action right now, but we need to be making those decisions as rapidly as possible and not listening to the voices from the fossil fuel industry and others that misled us every time we had that decision point in the past.
Thanks very much, and thanks for highlighting that misleading nature of what the lobby of the fossil fuels has done over the last 40 years, because it is 40 years since they've known about it at least. So we're in this panel looking at both the global and the local. So I want to come now and talk with Mete and with Cassie about the cities, and what are you seeing in terms of progress? And what are you also seeing in terms of this energy crisis and the way it's affecting city strategies to try and reach that net zero? But also, what are the harms that are being done, particularly to different groups and disadvantaged groups in cities? So could I go first to Mete and then I'll come to Cassie?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I think you highlight a very important point, because often we could talk about this conversation at a very international or national level, forgetting that ultimately, if we are going to reach net zero, it's going to be cities and local authorities that are going to be having to drive forward the change that we need. So in my role, I'm the cabinet member responsible for the environment and transport in Hackney. And what that requires me to do is obviously lead on our response to tackle the climate crisis and reach net zero by 2030. And that's everything from what we're doing around low carbon development to decarbonising our transport system, to our public realm, and all the sorts of different things that we need to do. And clearly what I see in my role is there's a massive disconnect between the rhetoric that you get, for example, from conversations that, like at COP26, for example, be the reality of the resources, the legislative changes that need to happen at a national level, and the money that we need to be able to actually deliver this change. So, in Hackney, for example, we've declared a climate emergency in 2019, like most local authorities, and we actually recently got ranked as the best council in the UK for our response for climate change. We've been rolling out low traffic neighbourhood schemes across 70% of eligible roads, encouraging more people to use buses by, increasing bus priority, for example, moving towards things like retrofit, but it's so expensive. And we were talking about this, Phil, wasn't we? And to give you all a flavour, in London, an average property costs about £80,000 to £90,000 to fully retrofit a unit. So you probably need about 112 billion, finance-wise, in London to go for fully retrofit. The reality of the funding that we have is only about 2 billion split across different boroughs. And 74% of carbon emissions come from the way in which we heat our homes and from our buildings. So there's a massive gap in terms of what the rhetoric is you get around the government's net zero energy strategy, what local authorities have to actually deliver forward a retrofit program. And then there are further complexities to that in terms of how the charges are then sort of distilled into, sort of filtered out into the community. So for example, if you're a leaseholder who lives on an estate, do you cover the costs for that? These are like little practical things that you have to think about, and people don't, understandably don't want to sort of pay for these things. But my view is ultimately, I think we need to shift the narrative around this debate, around how we reach net zero. I think we need to excite people to towards the shift to a more greener and sustainable future. And what I mean by that is, obviously we're doing this because we're trying to save the planet. Otherwise, none of us will be here to sort of exist to even be talking about this sort of stuff. But it's got to be about, it's a bit like the tech revolution. I remember when the tech revolution was happening about 10, 15 years ago, particularly in some parts of London, people were really excited about the job opportunities that were going to come out of it. And for me, you know, coming from a background where, you know, people who look and sound like me are more likely to suffer from the negative effects of bad air pollution, for example, living in areas where they're densely populated, you know, really bad nitrogen dioxide levels. One of the things that we saw from the pandemic was that, you know, people who are stuck in council estate blocks didn't have the outside space where they could enjoy greenery, and they were stuck in their tower blocks. And of course, you know, jobs that aren't secure. So for me, it's about, when I speak to people in Hackney, I always try to highlight to them, look, imagine what we can do to your neighborhood in terms of when you're walking home to go from work to home, you're not just rushing that journey, but you're actually enjoying that journey. So street trees, community parklets, you know, drop curbs, how you imagine parking spaces, all those things are very fundamental to this conversation that we're having around this. And then it's about, you know, how do we make sure that you get a good job out of it? So really exciting people. I mean, we're talking about electricity, the solar panels that have got to be installed. We just launched a new community energy fund. One of the things that we've done with the community energy fund is we set up community energy groups. So it's a cycle where you create the community energy fund for public buildings to go towards more energy efficiency. You establish community energy groups so that the energy is publicly owned. But then also, one of the requirements is that the jobs that are created has to be for local people. So it's that cycle where it's, you know, it's for the public, owned by the public, and you're creating job opportunities out of it. And then obviously the big thing about, you know, one of the things that, you know, local authorities can lead on is air quality. So I guess to summarize, I think the challenge we're facing, and we've just developed a new climate action plan where it details our implementation plan over the next 3 years around what we're going to do to reach net zero. We can set as many actions as we want, but the reality is that, you know, the big stuff, like the retrofit, which is the big emissions, we don't have the resources for.
Thank you very much. That's so important to hear. And Cassie, you've just come back from a conference of many of the major cities of the world in Buenos Aires. Can you say a little bit, following on from Mete, what has inspired you out of that in terms of the progress that cities are making, but also the challenges that now come from the Russian invasion?
Yeah, of course, and thanks for having me, inviting me today. I mean, I think Mete has just made a great point that cities are leading the way. You know, Mete there just threw out the target of net zero by 2030, you know, and we're talking here about, oh, should we be thinking about 2050? No, we need to be thinking about 2030, and cities are really leading the way and leading the transformation on this. So C40, the organisation I'm from, is a network of 96 global cities, mainly mega cities from all around the world, representing cities across every region. And 3/4 of the C40 cities are reducing emissions faster than their respective nation states. It shows that cities are able to make change. Cities are actually the first responders to the impacts of climate change. Those impacts are being felt in their cities, the flooding, the heat waves, the droughts, with huge populations being affected. And cities understand people who live in their cities. Their mayors do, their governing powers and their governing bodies. So really they can design the solutions in order to provide the most relief to those in the cities. But all of C40 cities have a requirement to produce a 1.5 degree compliant climate action plan. All of the cities have produced this, which also shows it's possible. It's possible to have a 1.5 degree compliant action plan. I agree with Mete's point. It doesn't mean that they've got all the resources to deliver it, but they can actually set out what's needed and really show that leadership. And by contrast, my understanding is there is no country that has submitted a nationally determined contribution that is 1.5 degree compliant. So we're really seeing mayors of our cities as policymakers that are creating not only that huge ambition, but also those investment opportunities in zero emission, inclusive and efficient projects and infrastructure. And I thought Vanessa made, wonderful points earlier on, but the particular point of the focus on inclusive climate action, that there can be no climate action that isn't inclusive, that doesn't consider the people who are actually being affected by it, and that not everybody is being affected equally. And we really need to be designing our climate solutions in that way. You mentioned we had our World Mayors Summit in Buenos Aires last week, where we brought together over 1,000 people and mayors of over 30 cities to come together to really tackle what are some of these climate actions we can take. And C40 mayors have come together to say that by 2030, they will drive the creation of 50 million new green jobs, recognizing that climate action can bring huge benefits in terms of job creation, in terms of better health, improved air quality, and economic benefits. And those 50 million new good green jobs are a third more than business as usual. So we know again that there's a huge benefit that can be delivered there. And so I think that's really, we need to take that leadership of cities. Cities are agile, they're able to move quickly, they're able to respond to their residents and their citizens. And governments need to be meeting cities at that level of ambition. They need to help them to support, to be able to deliver their commitments, but also match it and really learn from some of that leadership.
Thank you very much. That's inspiring to hear, and it's so important that you've emphasised that issue of co-benefit, the extraordinary ways. I mean, 50 million new green jobs would be an extraordinary contribution to some of the challenges that we face at the moment. I'm going to zoom back out now to more of the global, and just Jeff and Barnaby, I want to ask you about the multilateral system and how you see we can start to create better conditions. At the moment, the multilateral system, even the plurilateral system, is pretty much broken, with increased levels of rivalries, geopolitical rivalries between different camps. What do you think are the avenues for regaining some of the trust and cooperation that we're going to need between states in order to really tackle the climate crisis? So I'll go to Barnaby first and then come to you, Jeff.
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe we should talk about COP, seeing as it's in less than 2 weeks' time, and that's why we all have bags under our eyes. Last year, I did a story. We found that there were 503 fossil fuel lobbyists at COP that we were easily able to identify, right? They were bigger than the largest single delegation from any country. At COP, there were twice as many fossil fuel lobbyists as there were in the official UN constituency for indigenous people. You know, there is a reason why we have a lack of faith in these processes when decisions we know are smart and are reasonable and are rational are not being taken. And I think last year's COP was the first time that fossil fuels had been mentioned in an official announcement from the process. We can see that this process is polluted, and that's part of the reason why sensible decisions are not being taken. We need to take action to actually restore faith in those institutions, create conflict of interest processes and frameworks where we treat the climate problem as a problem created by the fossil fuel industry, among others, and actually recognize that while the fossil fuel industry followed the tobacco industry playbook for discrediting, denying, deceiving, and delaying action on the climate crisis, we need to follow the same playbook in restricting their access. The tobacco industry is prohibited from taking part in public health talks by a treaty that was agreed back in 2005. We should be talking about excluding the fossil fuel industry from these processes, having a fossil fuel-free politics, kicking big polluters out of COP, and trying to restore faith so that decision makers are listening to people and not big polluters and are taking decisions that make sense to all the rest of our eyes.
That's great, thank you, and I like that. Let's have some fossil fuel-free politics. I always remember when I used to believe that public policy followed evidence, and then I realized that actually there's a massive vested interest that interfere in that process, and you've described that extraordinarily well. Jeff, over to you. How do you see the opportunities to create a greater trust and cooperation at the multilateral level?
I want to start with a big misnomer that Russia created the energy crisis. The situation in Ukraine may not have been direct, but it was very closely related to the energy crisis, meaning Russia didn't cause the energy crisis caused Russia. I mean, it was very apparent due to underinvestment in all commodities, just not fossil fuels, but all commodities. The world was really short. We started calling for a commodity supercycle in October 2020. We call it the revenge of the old economy, meaning you're not investing in the old economy, you end up being short all this stuff. I don't care if it's food, fuel, capital goods, copper, you name it, we're short it right now. And when it became very apparent last summer we were short this, Russia started to take advantage of it. And you look at energy crisis really out of control, summer of 21, he amasses troops on the border of Ukraine in October of 21. Now, so the question is, how do we solve this problem and reduce emissions? You know, I like to borrow a line from Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, who's the climate czar of the UAE. He goes, hold back emissions, not progress. So let's talk about, to answer your question, in a deglobalized world, how are we going to deal with this? And ironically, if we go back, I'd love to just use the example of how did we deal with this problem in the 70s. It's kind of the same setup. No investment, a very significant energy crisis going on in a deglobalized world. By the way, the cause of the underinvestment in the 60s and 70s, identical to today. Interest rates too low, you chase pie-in-the-sky activities, and you ignore the things that you need to deal with today. LBJ kept them too low in the 60s, and guess what? You had the nifty 50 in the 60s. This time around, it was the FANG boom when we had 0% interest rates. You underinvest in your basics, and by 68, the inflation started taking off because you had LBJ's Great Society. Here, it was the underinvestment coupled with COVID. Now, I want to bring it back to climate change because then it was the war on acid rain. Today, it's the war on climate change. So it's in our DNA. We know how to solve this problem. The way we solved it, though, was through compliance. Rules and regulations around desulfurization, and if you violated them, you went to jail or you paid a fine, like what happened with Volkswagen. But how did you get to that state? And if we think about it, it's very similar setup. Problem was very apparent in Germany. The Americans and the Soviets, the hegemons, ignored it. You had deglobalization between the two of them. Finally, the problem was so out of control in the United States with Lake Erie on fire, Nixon does something about it. By the way, on Nixon, here's an important point. In the history of all these governments, and I was reminded yesterday it's upside down in France, Labor, Democrats, call it the left, has never created viable environmental policy. It's always come from the right, like Richard Nixon in 1970. I think the reason for that is they can harness the corporates behind them. I don't know why. It's just an observable fact in history. He does the Clean Air Act amendment. Now, how did you get the Soviets on board? Actually, it was their forests started melting. They had a problem. They needed to deal with it. And in the nuclear treaty, they wrapped up the rules and regulations around it as law and forced it upon the world. So, long answer to your question, but I think there's a lot to be learned that, hey, don't worry, the deglobalization didn't stop prudent policy in the 70s.
Yeah, that's great, and thank you. I mean, it's so important what you're saying about the rules and regulation, and also criminal and civil liability being essential in terms of it demanding the proper implementation of laws by business and investors themselves. Cassie and Mete, I want to come back to you now and talk about similar issues. Vulnerable populations of women, vulnerable populations and women in the global south are the first and worst affected, as we've heard from Vanessa in particular today. But those voices are often lost in the debate. And what strategies are you seeing that are going to be able to really build those voices, help them strengthen themselves in terms of their own ability to influence and make sure that the voices of youth, the voices of more marginalized populations, the voices of women come much more strongly to the fore? Cassie, I'll come to you first, and then Mete, I'll come over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I think we've mentioned already that climate action can't succeed without addressing some of these social inequalities and really ensuring that the most vulnerable benefit, but are also involved in the decision making and have the ability and voice to design those schemes and interventions that are affecting them. We're seeing a number of examples from C40 mayors that are really prioritizing this and giving example of action, everything from rollouts of local Green New Deals, programs to implement a just transition for workers, creating good quality local jobs, and ensuring they're accessible, and for gender-led action. But maybe I'll just give you some examples. Maybe this is the best way to do it. So in Bogota, we're seeing a great initiative from the public transport operator, where they've started to train, now in a small scale, but 75 of 450 women who would totally be involved in the program, to become the drivers of brand new electric buses in the city. And Bogota has one of the biggest growing fleets of electric buses outside of China. They're really leading the way on this development. And they're expecting to have the whole of the fleet driven by women who will be trained up through this program. And that will be a total of 195 electric buses that will be driven by women just by the end of this year. So really showing leadership, showing that they, making sure that new jobs are accessible to women and to those who need it. So that's one example. I'll maybe give you a couple of others. And actually, it's slightly to Jeff's point, which I read as like polluter pays, Jeff, right? You need your polluter to pay. So, we're seeing also some interventions. I'll give you a good example from Stockholm, where they have a road user pricing scheme, and households on high incomes pay nearly 3 times as much as those on low incomes. And so it's really showing that you shouldn't just be blanket applied any of these charges or prices in cities or in countries. And that kind of approach has actually led to cutting the amount of cars on the road by 20%, and it takes the proceeds of those road user pricing, and that's funneled into new public transport infrastructure, walking infrastructure, and cycling infrastructure in the city. So I could talk about city examples all day, but I'll give you those 2 to make them land, and I'll give you a couple of others later on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Cassie. That's inspiring indeed. Mete, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, the fact that we're even here talking about this issue right now with a full room has shown how far we've come. I mean, I don't know how much of you have been sort of engaged in the sort of climate change debate for some time, but 10 years ago, trying to put together a room of people to talk about how we're going to, improve our environment was very, very difficult. Yeah. And I think a big part of that is because it's been young people who've led the way, who've brought about the conversation now, where there are very little countries out there now where you could stand to be the president or the prime minister without talking about climate change as a big priority. It is a big priority for most leaders now, and every leader mainly is expected to have a pledge around it. And that's because of the great work of people like Vanessa and others who've really got that debate to where it is today. I mean, I think it's criminal that, young people don't have a seat at the table at a global level to really drive that ambition when given that, it's going to be future generations who are going to have to live with the, and the conversation is no longer, are we going to see the impacts of climate change or not? We're already seeing the impacts of climate change. I mean, Cassie was talking about the floods in London, like it's, or the heat, 40 degrees weathers. These are things that, you would never have ever thought that you would have already seen. So I think the conversation is now is, the best time to act was obviously yesterday, and the next best time to act is obviously today, which is like President Obama says. And I think, we need to really drive forward that ambition. And I think young people are key to that. My only other worry is that I do think there is a big problem around climate literacy, which particularly for, like, if you look at London context, and maybe Cassie can add a bit more sort of insight into this as well, but I see this from a Hackney level where there are so many communities that are impacted by climate change, but they don't know it, or they don't have the time to talk about it because they're more concerned about having to think about their day-to-day life, about work, etc. So, one of the struggles I'm having at the moment is really trying to bring about, we have a Green New Deal in Hackney. We're the only borough in London who has a £50 million Green New Deal. And that came because we had a climate summit of basically young people from different schools across our eco schools who was just banging on about it for ages. And then in the end, we adopted it as a manifesto commitment and took it into to the council. But still, one of the things that I don't feel comfortable about is when we had a citizen assembly, for example, or certain different engagement events, it's very difficult to get people who have, for example, English, like my mum, for example. My mum's a care worker. She doesn't speak English properly. How do you engage with someone like her who's more likely to be impacted by the cost of living crisis through the energy bills? She lives in an area where it's got very, very high levels of bad air pollution, and her job probably, it's not the most greenest. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we need to think about how do we improve climate literacy, and we need to think about climate literacy in schools. I think it's positive that we've got now the GCSE education around climate change, but I think we need to go much further than that.
Fantastic. I think that's so important. The climate literacy, I remember I actually did visit about probably 20 years ago, the Turkana region that Vanessa spoke about. And when I asked people there why they felt that the rains were failing so often, because they were failing already at that time, and half the people said it's because of you and the climate that's upon us. So there was a climate literacy amongst half the population, but the other half of the population said it's to do with me and the sins of our community, and it's God's visitation on us. And that was such a tragic sense of blaming oneself for what is something that's been externally imposed upon people. It's great to hear from Vanessa that that mood has shifted substantially in the right direction, and people now feel not only that they can identify who are the culprits of this, but also that they feel agents of their own change as well. And that's true of Lake Turkana, where there's extraordinary levels of organisation. So that's wonderful. We're going to move now to questions. We're going to have 5 minutes at the end to come back to you for some final thoughts. But let's go first to some roving mics. I've got 5 questions in on the app. I won't be able to get to all of them, but let's also do a roving mic. I'll take 2 questions from the floor and 1 from the whatever it is, this small machine in my lap. Can we have questions, please? There's one here, and one at the back. Oh, yes. One at the back first, because the mic is there.
Thank you. It's a question about the compliance and rules and regulations point I think that Jeff was making. On the one hand, it's reassuring to hear that we've been in a similar situation in the 70s, but given the geopolitical situation out there and the differences that are so clear and apparent from different nation states, can he talk, or the panel in general, talk more about how we get from where we are to actually having those rules and regulations in place?
Yep.
Particularly, I guess, what's the minimum viable number of states and other actors out there that we would need?
That's a great question. How do we get to those rules and regulations? And there's, I think, a gentleman at the front. I'm looking for hands all the time. So for the next round, we'll have 1 round now, and we'll probably get 2 rounds in. Over to you, sir.
First of all, thank you for everything you've said so far in the discussion. It's been fascinating. I'd really like to hear your opinion on how we manage the messaging at the moment, because I think there's a lot of conflicting information, particularly the messaging around creating a sustainable world. I think net zero in its own right has challenges where certain technologies are then promoted over others, which things like carbon capture and storage, which we need, but it also lends itself to keeping us addicted to fossil fuels. So how do we turn the sustainability, the clean air, as you were talking about, and climate change into some messaging that just makes things kind of obvious and makes sense from your perspectives?
Great. So we've got, how do we get those rules and regulations in, and what scale and scope of that needs to be achieved geographically? We've got the how do we create those compelling messages that make things clear and obvious. And I'm going to take one from the screen, which is today Shell has reported $9.5 billion for the 3rd quarter, compared to $4.1 billion in the same quarter last year. Does this demonstrate quite how off track we are? So, those 3 questions, please don't answer all of them. You can only take 1, maximum 2 if you're very good. But because we've only got 15, we've got 17 minutes left. Jeff, over to you first.
Okay, I think in terms of getting to having a dialogue around real policy, the only way you get through there is pain. I don't care. Give me any history, a credit crisis of, how did Richard Nixon do it? Lake Erie caught on fire, and every single American knew they had to do this. Unfortunately, you look at history, that's the only way you get to it. And then to answer the questioning, about messaging, the only way we're going to get the right message is create those laws. And then you go, hey, you go figure out how. You got to get those emissions down. You got to hit that target. I don't care how you hit that target. You're hitting that target. Or you're getting fined, and you're going to jail. And you'll find the most efficient way to do it. And that's the way we did it in the 60s, in the 70s. And by the way, the cost of compliance ended up being fraction. By the way, I will go out and say $60 trillion to solve climate change right now. I don't know where that number is. There was some guy like me sitting up on stage in 1967 probably saying $60 trillion to solve climate change or acid rain problem. You know what it ended up being was a fraction, because once you had the rules and regulation, people got innovative and figured out how to do it. On the point about Shell, since I'm the one who probably can answer that, the reason why those returns are so high is because we're underinvesting. And here's the point about ESG. It makes a higher price than a carbon tax. And it's a tax we're not collecting. Who, as we, meaning the UK or the United States or whatever it might be, who's collecting that tax? Russia. And I'll let your mind go to where those tax revenues go. But I think the key point, that's really high because the price is high because we're not investing.
That's fantastic. And I'd just say on that, I was with a VP of a very large company the other day, and he said regulation drives board attention, and it also drives company innovation. And as you say, when things are defined and have to be implemented, people innovate the ways to find it.
Can I say one last thing? When Cassie said, you pollute, you pay, that's where we need to be.
Cassie, straight to you, please.
Yeah, I'll just do the one question. Don't worry, Phil. One question about that kind of, how do we get that messaging right? I mean, I agree. Regulation drives action. I agree. But I do think we've got a job on the climate literacy as well. I do think we've got to bring people with us. And the way I like to look at it is for years we've talked about, those of us in the climate field, the co-benefits of climate action. We've said if you tackle emissions here, you'll get co-benefits like jobs and improved health, and you'll save money on your bills. Well, I think we need to flip it around. I think these are really now the entry points for climate action. And we should be seeing that the best thing governments, mayors, other policymakers can do for their citizens' health, for their pockets, for their future job creation opportunities, is to invest in climate action. So if you want to do something to improve the health of your citizens, you tackle air quality. And really kind of shifting that around, that really drives some of the real things that will happen. And I think that would also help to bring people along with us, to Mete's point before, if you're actually talking about health as a starting point, rather than having to always explain the kind of climate crisis and why we're here.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Barnaby.
Yeah, so, I mean, first, very quickly on the Shell thing. Yeah, it's a perfect illustration of where our current addiction has got us, right? The money's just going straight into the pockets of shareholders at Shell and into Putin's war machine, right? This is the problem. That very well illustrates the massive problem of our addiction and how we need to get off that. On the messaging, yeah, it's a massive issue, especially when there is no controlled message. Lots of people have a voice in the room, and there's plenty of people shouting very loudly about very crap techno fixes, whether that's CCS, whether that's hydrogen for every purpose, without talking about, hydrogen already creates more emissions than aviation does, and it's 99% from gas and coal. And so, yeah, it's great technology. Some of it will be useful in the future for industrial stuff, but it's not a solution right now, and it doesn't justify building fossil fuel infrastructure right now. Decision makers and the public need to be a bit more suspicious, a bit more critical of easy technological solutions that are being sold at great cost to you. That said, we have simple ones that are much more positive. And I completely agree with what Mete and Cassie have been saying of, there's a really positive message to be told here of living in a place which is more pleasant to be in, where you're going along tree-lined streets on your bike. You don't have to have an electric car. You don't need an electric car. You can live happily without one. There's a reason why if you watch, the adverts on the tube or the adverts on the telly for holidays, half of them have people riding a bike somewhere in a nice nature-filled place. People want to live in that place.
Yeah.
Now, with retrofits, you were saying it's going to cost tens of thousands of pounds to retrofit, especially in the UK, our really old, leaky housing stock and reduce the cost of our heating and make that lower carbon. But the fact is, loads of people live in houses that are kind of horrible, and that you have corners of your house that are drafty and cold. No one really wants to sit in that room. And if you can draft-proof it, if you can put in cheap lagging in your loft or cavity wall insulation, that stuff is not expensive, and it genuinely improves people's quality of lives, as well as radically reducing their heating bills, especially today. There's a positive message there.
Thanks, Barnaby. That's wonderful. Mete.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think there is a bit of a conflict between the previous question about the rules and regulations and the messaging. And I say that because I see this at a local government level where we're very, Hackney Council, I would say, is probably the most radical council when it comes to reducing transport emissions, right? When you look at like our low traffic neighbourhoods, I don't know if anyone follows the debate around it, 70% of eligible roads are low traffic neighbourhoods, which is very, very high compared to any other borough. We've got 51% bus priority. We've got 48 school streets. So if you're a car driver, you know, I'm your biggest fan, basically. But the point is that there is a conflict between, you know, doing the right thing and the messaging, because ultimately we don't have time, and we need to take action. But then also, I think the problem we have is that in the absence of rules and regulations, in order for us to tackle climate change, it's going to come down to individuals, to all of us, in terms of how we, you know, dress, for example, how we eat, how we move around, how we travel, all those sorts of things. And I think that often what I get from people is, you know, why are you picking on me as the little man? Go after the big company, right? Go after the big emitters. And I think what we need to do is make it practical to people. So it's things like, do you know what? We increase bus price. That means that your bus is going to move much more quicker. Your speed and waiting time is going to go much more quicker. Or do you know what? For example, you could just pick up a bike and cycle and go anywhere. So it's about making it much more practical to people so that they can actually see it.
Great. What a great we got a great combination here. The messaging has to be right, but also the rules and the regulation have to be right as well. We need to take the public with us while we make these extraordinary radical efforts that are necessary. So I'm going to take two more speakers. And I've got not speakers, questions. They have to be short questions. We've got 5 minutes left. One there and one there. Fantastic. All right, let's go. Number one, please.
Hi, thank you for hearing so far. I just wanted to ask, have you got any advice to journalists on how we can stress the importance and urgency of climate change? Is it exposure or without oversaturate? Thank you.
Great. And number two, that was very short and clear. Thank you. I can see you're a journalist. Number two.
Hi, so like you, Barnaby, I was absolutely horrified when I went to COP26 and I saw the creators of the problem that we're in presenting themselves as the solution. So specifically Volkswagen, Ford, leading these discussions about how we were going to decarbonize transport, when those who understand the sector know there's no way that electric cars are going to provide solutions to the transport problems we face and to decarbonising. How do we stop? What's the pathway to us stopping these people capturing the narrative and capturing the subsidies that come from government that cause us to stay stuck in this loop? How do we create the change that we need?
Great. Thank you very much. That's also very clear. So we've got a question, advice to journalists, and also the question of how do we stop the opposition, the people for business as usual, capturing the narrative and continuing to capture the subsidies. So I'll go this way this time. You're going to have to be very quick because otherwise you won't get your minute at the end, and I want you to get that minute. Over to you, Mete.
I'm going to answer that question.
Please.
We can't have a car-led recovery, I think, from the pandemic. And I think, you know, if we'll be in a massive illusion if we think that, you know, replacing all petrol, diesel cars with electric cars is a good thing. That's absolutely, you know, we need to get away from that. And I think what we really need, and particularly in cities, and I know the Mayor of London, obviously through C40's network, is really passionate about this too, is we need to be much more stricter around, you know, like, as I say, the policies we bring in. You know, one of the things that I've volunteered Hackney to do is to bring road user charge pricing models to Hackney as a pilot to be a borough. Because I don't think that, you know, car-led recovery, I think when you think about the road space, I think we need to reimagine our roads. So I think, you know, what we ultimately need in order to answer your question is we need brave politicians to stop those companies from controlling the narrative. And the other thing we need people who are underrepresented, particularly young people, to be leading that voice in those decisions so that we can stop and we can find balance to that conversation.
Fantastic. Exemplary brief as well, but those are critical points, I think, for us to take away in terms of the narrative. Barnaby.
On the journalism thing, with my investigative journalist hat on, keeping focus on the issue. Like it's not, COP isn't just for Christmas, you know, it's every day. You know, climate is something that's happening all the time, and we need to keep that focus on it. It's so easy to lose it in other issues. As journalists, as climate journalists, but as all journalists, we need to inform ourselves so that we can differentiate between a crap techno fix and a good idea. Like climate journalism has dealt with denial 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We've gotten better than a lot of other bits of journalism at dealing with that. But solutions washing, delayism, this kind of stuff is really insidious. And like, we need to be proactively telling those stories to inoculate the public against misinformation around big events like COP, rather than just chasing clicks because someone's brought out something provocative at the time. We need to inoculate the public with accurate information about these issues, as well as, inoculate ourselves as journalists to talk about these issues more effectively, as well as shining lights on the angles that might be missed: equity, justice, and fairness in the transition.
Great. Cassie?
Yeah, I'm going to do a bit of both. Question. Sorry, Phil, to mess around with the system.
No.
But I think the answer to the one before over this side was we do need to reimagine our cities and reimagine kind of the way we live. It's not just a switch out your diesel cars for electric cars. Or Barnaby, you and I were talking about hydrogen earlier on and saying that that's being seen as, oh, it's okay, we'll put hydrogen into our existing gas network and that'll be the answer. And it's not. It's not. It's just locking in carbon emissions for decades to come. So I think it is about reimagining and being bold about that reimagining and knowing that it will return a better outcome for people. And then on the journalist bit, I agree on keeping focus. I also think journalists have a responsibility to pick and champion the right voices. And I think ensuring that those voices are diverse, that they reflect the communities that we're trying to reach, and that those voices are trusted and given the weight and gravitas that they deserve.
Great. And Jeff, I wanted to come to you, but I wanted to give you another 10 seconds max, just to speak also about ESG. We did get a question about ESG saying, is this part of the solution? So you can answer one of those questions and just say a few moments on ESG.
The answer is, every month that goes by, you asked me that question 6 months ago, I thought there was a chance ESG can solve that problem. Today, I don't think it can. The reason why you don't invest in fossil fuels, you'll turn to the cheapest, quickest energy source, which is wood and coal, and that's where emissions go up. But to answer the question about what can journalists do and the issue around EVs and so forth, it's education. And I think that really sits at the center, because I don't think there's an understanding of how the world really works and where the emissions come from. And the reason why we can't replace all of these internal combustion engines with EVs is, it goes back to that point. We're using an organic fuel, which, by the way, put 20 liters of a fuel onto a car and you burn it. Inorganic energy is solar, wind, and nuclear. The reason why a Tesla weighs 2,000, 3,000 pounds more than the other car is because you're trying to replicate that carbon-hydrogen bond that sits in that organic energy source. And I know I'm probably talking too much, but it's education that everybody starts to understand these issues, and the debate can be held with an equal footing.
Fantastic. So now you've got about 50 seconds left. But many people here will be looking at COP with expectations. Many people will be going, some people will be participating virtually. If there's one message you would want to see properly addressed at the COP, or a message that you'd want people here to deliver to COP, what would that one message be? And I'm going to go to Cassie first.
Oof, the pressure. So yeah, I think for me the message is quite clear that we need to demonstrate that climate action and investing in greener, more resilient cities, not fossil fuels, are really the best way to protect people from rising prices, from heavily polluted air, and the impacts of climate change. And I would love at COP if it was also noted that cities are leading the way, very happy for countries to steal the actions that cities are taking and replicate them. And my final thing is actually stealing Vanessa's line that I thought was great, that is, fossil fuels are a bridge to nowhere.
Excellent. Chilling line. Thank you. Mete.
Yeah, I guess just to kind of build on Cassie's point, I think, one of the things that were absent from last year that I would like to see is obviously the roles that cities can play and a bigger voice for local government, because ultimately we're the ones that will drive the change forward in terms of policy. So I think there needs to be a bigger presence of local government at these conversations, and ultimately we're going to need much more legislative powers to be able to make a difference. So even in the context of like waste, for example, right? Like we can only do so much in terms of encouraging people to recycle more. Ultimately, not all plastic, for example, is recyclable. You're going to need legislative change. Also thinking about how people manage their waste as well. These are like very practical things that you have to think about in the context of a wider conversation. So I think a commitment to giving local authorities more power to tackle climate crisis is what I'd like to see.
Great. Barnaby.
I mean, let's follow through on the commitments that have been made, and let's talk about power. Let's talk about whether we should be listening to people with voices like Vanessa's excellent pleas this morning, or to polluters. Let's talk about having conflicts of interest policies. Let's talk about restoring trust conference, in these processes, right? Let's not just let the status quo proceed as it is, because we're not getting there nearly as fast as we need to.
Great. And Jeff, finally.
Communicate to governments that they're the only ones who can solve this problem. The public policy is the only one. Investors cannot solve it. Individuals can't solve it. There has to be rules, compliance, and as we talked about, taxes, jail time, fines, whatever, there has to be a compliance to it. Without that, there is no hope. And by the way, it needs to start in America. The Europeans are there. The Chinese will get on board with the Europeans. You need the Americans to do it.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much. What a fantastic panel. I want to just say, I think we've heard, such powerful voices speaking directly to what Vanessa was speaking to as well, that people and justice being at the center of this. The justice in terms of the radical rules, the radical transformation of the rules that's necessary, as well as for people that compelling narrative that we must be able to force, and which journalists and the Thomson Reuters Foundation are playing such a fundamental role in delivering, both at the local level, through to the city level, through to the nation, region, and finally also globally. And we hope that happens at the COP27 this time. Fingers crossed. Thank you very much to the audience and all the people. Thanks again to the panel.